We're going to kind of finish the last of Absalom. So if you remember where we left off last week, we left off with Joab killing Absalom even against David's wishes. So we're going to kind of finish that whole part of the story and then go into the beginning of the reconciliation with Israel. And so starting at the beginning of chapter 19, Joab was told, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. Then Joab went to the house to the king and said, Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be the worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth till now. So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. Meanwhile the Israelites had fled to their homes. Throughout the tribe of Israel, all the people were arguing among themselves, saying, The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country to escape from Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood, so why would you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, Are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army for life in the place of Joab. He won over the hearts of the men of Judah, so that they were all of one mind. They sent word to the king, Return, you and all your men. Then the king returned and went as far as the Jordan. Now the men of Judah had come to Galgul to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan, where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king, and said to him, May the Lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. For I, your servant, now know I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet you, my lord the king. Then Abishai son of Zeruiah said, Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. David replied, What does this have to do with you, sons of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel? So the king said to Shimei, You shall not die. And the king promised him on oath. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came to Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth? He said, My lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled, and I will ride on it, so I can go with the king. But Ziba my servant betrayed me, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king, but you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king? The king said to him, Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land. Mephibosheth said to the king, Let him take everything, now that my lord king has returned home safely. Barzillai the Gileadite also came down from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Now Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He had provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you. But Barzillai answered the king, How many more years will I live, that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance. But why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town, near the tomb of my father and mother. But here is your servant, Kimham. Let him cross over, my lord the king. Do for him whatever you wish. The king said, Kimham shall cross over with me. I will do for him whatever you wish, and anything you desire from me I will do for you. So all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and bid him farewell, and Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over Galgo, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. Soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan, together with all his men? All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves? Then the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, We have 10 shares in the king, so we have greater claim on David than you have. Why then do you treat us with contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing back our king? But the men of Judah pressed their claims even more forcefully than the men of Israel. And so what we see here is a lot of things, but the overwhelming theme here is that David has been victorious, and he is starting to make his arrangements to return. Now we start with sort of the aftermath of Joab murdering Absalom. I say murder because he did it against the king's wishes, and he did it while not in battle, but after Absalom had been effectively neutralized and couldn't really defend himself. And so what we have here is this father weeping for his son. And we see him weeping to the point where the army feels humiliated. They feel like they probably feel guilty for the loss themselves, and so they, it notes that they even steal in quietly back in there instead of being victorious and making it feel more bitter for the king. Joab comes to the king, and instead of being guilt-ridden, apologetic, or anything, he tries to really talk down the king and saying that he's humiliated the men. He's not going to have any of them left with the way he's humiliated them, and so he needs to reconcile himself and get over it and go congratulate the men. And then David, actually follows his lead and stands in the gateway and takes acknowledges the men and what they've done. And this is an area where both Joab and both David are partially right. David has full right to be mourning the loss of his son. Joab is within his right to say, "Listen, you're mourning, and your feelings are destroying the army who effectively restored you the kingdom, and you need to do it." And this is just one of those areas where, to me, both people can be right, both people can be wrong. And frankly, in all of our lives, most conflicts, most things that most of us all fight over, no one is clearly right, no one is clearly wrong. Both people are culpable for part right, part wrong. And that's something we need to consider as we go. Now, to be clear, Joab was absolutely wrong in murdering Absalom, but that's not the particular argument we're talking about at this point in time. We're talking about that David had full right to be mourning his son in the way that he was, and Joab had a right to tell him, listen, these people risked their lives for you, they saved you, you need to acknowledge them. Both are valid in their own rights. And now we start to get to the reconciliation. There's a couple things going on with the reconciliation that we're going to tackle. The first one is, as we see here, is that other than Joab himself, he generally reconciles completely with everyone, regardless of what how they treated him leaving. David's coming back with a victorious army. He could have really laid waste to anyone who showed any type of disloyalty here. But he actually, excuse me. That's what happens when you have a 10-month-old who won't sleep for you. You have a king who's reconciling for the most part, coming back over, and what we see here is the Israelites actually are the first ones to say, "Hey, why don't we bring the king back? Why aren't we bringing the king back?" And then we hear that Judah is afterwards. One of the reasons why this makes sense is, one, as we go into the next chapter, we're going to see a bit of we're not done with war, we're not done with betrayal. We're not done with this kind of civil fighting, and we're going to see some of the separation between Judah and Israel, and we start to see these fractures here. Remember, especially as we think about later in the Bible, Israel and Judah don't stay the same kingdom. They will separate, and what we see here is even at this point in time, there's fighting, there's fracturing between them, even under David, who has a united kingdom at this time. There are fractures. Also, remember that Absalom declared himself king in Hebron, where David had actually ruled in Judah. So in some ways, we can sort of infer between the lines that Judah was likely the first one to actually revolt against David initially, and they're the last to come back for one reason or another. But once they do come back, they come back full force, and they bring all the men of Israel, or all the men of Judah, there. And we see that that's going to cause a fight later on. Then we see that he brings Israel and brings all of them back in, and they return him. And what we see here is, again, he could have really laid waste here. He could have extracted a huge sum from Israel, and from Judah, and he doesn't. He reconciles, and that's something that I think is critically important. I know that there's still going to be more disturbances uh, in this kingdom, but I think one of the things that we should remember is the reconciliation, the forgiveness that we have, is way more important than the conflict itself. And in life, um, it's very easy for us, the way we perceive history, the way we perceive life, um, everything around us. Our nature is to focus on the war. Our nature is to focus on the fight. And if you think about history, think about the Civil War, think about World War II, think about the Revolutionary War. We spend a whole lot of time focusing on the war and the conflict. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't. We should, but we should know, and we should know those things. We spend a whole lot less time on the actual peace treaties and the resolutions that occur. We really like to focus on the conflict. We don't like to think about the peace. And I think that's just something to do with our wiring. We really like the conflict. Um, but what David shows us is we should really be more focused on the peace and going forward. And just to push this home, you can probably name most of the battles that occurred during any war and any conflict, and you can remember the major fights that you've had in your life. Do you remember in thinking about historical wars? Do you remember the treaties? Do you remember the ceasefires? Probably not. And likewise, do you remember the fights? Do you remember what started the fight, or do you remember the thing that saved it, or that saved us? And thank goodness, in the end, that Jesus and in the Gospels, they really focus on the salvation. They focus on the reconciliation. Jesus sets us right here and focuses on the reconciliation and the salvation of our sins versus the conflict between us and sin. He focuses on the saving, not the war. And because of that, ends it for us and makes it so that we can be with him forever. And so we see all of these people are coming. They are uh, putting themselves in front of the king, and the king is showing mercy. Even Mephibosheth comes, and we have this discussion that apparently he had been betrayed by Ziba, and tries to make it right with David. And David even reconciles him and says, "You two split it." And I think the reason why he's splitting is because this is one person against another. He also knows Ziba did help him and provide him at his weakest moment. And so, but even Mephibosheth is reconciling and saying, "Let him keep it. I am happy that the king is back." And we see all of these places, and we see the people that help him, like Barzillai. He wants Barzillai to come with him and stay with him. But Barzillai, in a moment of wisdom, with the age that he has, says, what do these things matter to me? The food I taste, I can't taste it. The wine I drink, I can't enjoy it. I can't hear the singers that you're talking about. Let me go and rest in peace and be calm. And I think this is one of those other microcosms of things we need to remember, is that the things that we find enjoyable, the things we find amazing in our life, they are fleeting things. They are not things that are going to satisfy us. Um, and really here, he shows us that, in the end, That grace of the king is the best thing. Same thing for us with Jesus. And then what we see, at the end is we see that the conflict's not over amongst the people. And so what we see here is we see David is being immensely reconciling to everyone that comes in front of him. But what we see here is we see that Israel and we see that Judah are fighting um, over the men that came over. That all the men of Judah came and only half the men of Israel came. And Israel's saying, "Why did you do that? You were the last one. Why did you bring everyone? You were the last people." And Judah's saying, "Well, what's it matter? We didn't take the king's provisions. We didn't cost him anything for that. We brought our own. What's it matter? We are close relatives. It means something to us. We're trying, we're trying that." And Israel is saying, "But we have 10 times the stake in him than you do. And we have this fight." And honestly, as I read this last part of the chapter here, um, what I felt like we were seeing the disciples near the end of Jesus' life at the Last Supper arguing who was the greatest. To me, this bitter fight between the two sides sounds so similar to them sitting there and saying, which one of us shall be greatest in front of Jesus? In front of Jesus, they were talking about who was going to be the greatest. And here we have them again in front of David, the victorious king, reuniting his kingdom, and all they can do is fight over the fact that Judah brought more people crossing over the Jordan than Israel did. And the problem is for one reason or another, we cannot resolve this conflict in this chapter. We can't resolve this conflict between the two kingdoms, because what we'll see here is that those two kingdoms are going to split again in the next chapter. And so despite everything that has happened, despite David being an ever immense reconciling figure, um, he cannot resolve this issue. One last thing to note, and I missed it. I apologize. I missed it earlier here. We also know that Joab's going to lose the army, is because what we do see is David finally gives command of the army to Amasa versus Joab, finally kind of making that final cutoff from Joab, which he should have done, rightly so, a long, long time before now. And so as we finish today, and this is a bit of a short one here, as we finish today, what we see here is when we reconcile ourselves and any other parties that are affiliated with it, that reconciliation needs to be absolute. For some reason, David is not able to intervene between Judah and Israel, or maybe because, remember, he is king, he cannot see everything in this world. He can't see everything that's going on with the men here. For some reason or another, he's reconciling everyone. But the problem is that the tribes themselves, the greater tribes, are unable to reconcile themselves. And what we find is we find what seems to be a very vain argument divide them, and for some reason he cannot bring them together. Now, as I mentioned before, we talked about the disciples, and that for a while there, even in front of Jesus himself, we know that they fought about who was the greatest, which is kind of like I said, this is in a similar vein type of fight here. Jesus calms them down and says the greatest be the one, and talks about being a servant and a leader. And the fact of the matter is, he's the greatest, but he's not going to say that. If they would have reconciled themselves, if Jesus would not have helped them to see their faults and reconcile them to each other, what would have happened to Christianity when Jesus is left? And let's say the 12 split apart and fracture, and they don't huddle together in the early times after Jesus' death. What would have happened to Christianity if it wasn't for Jesus keeping them together and reconciling them to each other? Christianity may not well be what it is today without Jesus. Well, it wouldn't be there without Jesus, period. But Jesus taking that final reconciliation between those men that he had to do. And it's here in David, he does everything right in reconciling here. But for some reason or another, because he is human and he can't do everything, he's unable to reconcile these tribes. And as a result, the kingdom will stay divided. And frankly, this fracture, even though eventually he will unite the kingdom again, this fracture just never fully goes away. It's never fully there. Judah seems to be always a bit separated from the rest of the tribes. They were before, they kind of are now. They will be here soon again. Um, and just it's one of the problems that we have here with the tribes is that we cannot see full reconciliation as it could. And we need to remember this in our lives. When reconciliation happens amongst ourselves and others and people we have conflict, the resolution, we must be resolute. We cannot keep any bit of an open wound. Any bit of weakness in that reconciliation will openly fracture again. We must forgive completely. We must resolve to forgive and reconcile completely. We cannot leave any bit of bitterness or holdout or blame in our hearts. Or else what will happen is it will stay there. And eventually it will expose itself, it will divide it, and it will rip apart again. And the reconciliation that we have will be worth nothing at that point. We have to remember to be complete in all of our reconciliations. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for um, kind of crazy weather, but the nicer weather that we've had today in the sunny. Um, Within that, please be with the people down in Kentucky, down in the South, as they are trying to recoup and rebuild. Please be especially with everyone in Kentucky, as that's been a travesty to watch, and just watch over them and help them, and help the families and people who have lost loved ones, help them right now to cope, and help everyone down there to rebuild. As we take this lesson and help us to always remember to reconcile completely. Help us to always reconcile to you completely as Jesus reconciled us to you. To help us to use that example to never allow even one shred of open ill feeling, um, ill feelings towards each other if we've wronged each other. Help us instead let the reconciliation be complete, be full. Let the scar be completely healed over and not be left to be a bit of an open wound, even a tiny one. Let us always reconcile ourselves and be harmonious with each other. Please be with all of us as we go over this week, as we get towards the holiday season. For everyone traveling, watch over them, take care of them, and let us just use this time. If there are any open wounds, help us to use this time to reconcile. To remember that Christ reconciled us to you. Help us to reconcile with each other during this holiday season. And we ask for this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, everyone, thank you for staying with us. Thank you for staying with us this evening. Just remember, church again at 10:45 next week, and we'll be back here again at 6 p.m. Tomorrow, next Sunday. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you soon, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.